I'm Sandy Bodzin, interviewing Ron Aaron on January 13th, 2026. So Ron, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so I was born in California and grew up in California, and my kind of whole extended family pretty much almost moved here 3 years ago. We had my daughter and her husband, my sister and her husband, my niece and her husband, my nephew and his wife and child, and my son-in-law's grandma, and then uh, uh, my niece's husband's parents all moved here. So we all from California.
So why did everybody move here at the same time?
Just we liked the values and lifestyle that's here more. And unfortunately, even though I was born in and grew up my entire life in California and spent my whole practically life there, it just started to deteriorate. Yeah. But and then I thought we would maybe discuss a little bit of my background.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about
family background.
Yes,
and so
about your family.
You know, a lot of history is devoted to the Eurocentric vision of the Jewish people, but there were also Jewish people that lived in Arab countries, which is where my background is from. So I was told that my ancestry goes back more than 500 years in Iraq, Baghdad. And so there actually was at one point in time, they said that the population of Baghdad was 1/3 Jewish, as I read somewhere, at its height. But sort of in the late 1800s, there were wars going on in Babylonia, and the Jews were being persecuted, and they were taking Jewish boys and putting them in the military for who knows how long.
Awful. Yeah.
And so, and my grandmother once said that when she was growing up, when her family would buy her new clothes, they would have to tear it and put patches on it to make them look old, because if she walked out with new clothes, she would get beat up. So there was that, and then eventually my my grandparents escaped Iraq, and in the very early 1900s, and the Iraqi Jews, a lot of them escaped around the same time, and they got on ships. Now at the time, the biggest industry in the early 1900s wasn't oil; it was actually spices. So they got off. They got off these trade ships from Iraq and settled in the Far East. My father was born in Rangoon, Burma at the time, which was a British colony at the time, and it's now known as Yangon, Myanmar, is the new name. But some people dispute it because it's sort of like a dictatorial regime, and some people still refer to it not as Myanmar but as Burma. So, anyway, yeah, that's where my dad was born, and my mother was born on a tiny little island in Indonesia, which was called Makassar, and but she was born there by fluke, because I think my grandfather, who was a trader at the time, had taken his wife, and she had to give birth while he was doing business there on that small island. But they actually lived in the city of Surabaya, Indonesia, and you know, and before World War II began, my grandfather had passed away, and so my grandmother was a very entrepreneurial woman for the day,
Yep.
and she had three businesses. This is my maternal grandmother. She was a distributor for Johnny Walker Scotch. She owned a motorcycle dealership and an optometrist store. And so she had these three very unrelated businesses that she was running. And my mother's, my grandmother noticed that leading up to the war, World War II, not knowing World War II of course was going to happen, they started having a big influx of Japanese who were coming in to buy glasses. And my grandmother said to my mother, who was only maybe 16 at the time, said, "You need to learn Japanese," because she was selling the eyeglasses to the customers. And so my grandmother bought her a book on how to learn Japanese. And my mother was a good student of language. She spoke many languages, actually, probably 8 in total. Wow. And same for my father too, as well. And so she was she learned to speak Japanese and was helping the Japanese customers. And when World War II finally did break out, I was told that the Japanese actually invaded Indonesia on bicycle. Wow. And they took over the country, and suddenly she noticed that all of her customers who she knew were wearing military uniforms. And basically, as I understand it, the Japanese for a few years were in Indonesia on a spying mission to see how they could take over the country. They wanted it for its oil, because it's a very, very oil-rich country, and they need oil for their military. So when the Japanese first invaded Indonesia, the Jews were kind of left alone. They were told to just remain at home, not do a lot outside, etc. But then, as you know, Japan was an ally of Germany, and the Gestapo made a visit to Indonesia to meet with the Japanese to get a prisoner head count. And they said that the Germans asked, "How many Dutch prisoners do you have?" Because Indonesia was a Dutch colony. Okay. "How many English prisoners do you have?" Because they had internment camps for citizens and military of those countries. So then the Gestapo asked the Japanese, "And how many Jewish prisoners do you have?" And the Japanese, I'm told, looked a little confused and said, "Well, they don't have a country. We're not at war with them." And the Germans told the Japanese, "No, you have to round up and put in camps all the Jewish people." Wow. So the Japanese, followed their allies, and they went with fixed bayonets door to door, rounded up all the Jews. Now, and my dad also was a businessman before World War II. He was selling aspirin tablets, and he was selling them all over Asia. He even went to Shanghai, and he was doing quite well for himself. But when the Japanese came, at this point in time, of course, my mother and father were not married yet, but when the Japanese came, they arrested, all the people, gave them a few minutes to pack one suitcase, and off they went in trucks. Women and children went to camps in one direction. Men, adult men, all were put in camps in another direction, separated.
In Japan?
In Indonesia.
Indonesia. Okay.
Indonesia. They were all living in the city of Surabaya, which is on the eastern end of the island of Java. And on the western end, you have the capital, Jakarta. But Surabaya is a big city, too. I'm not sure of exactly how many at the time, but I mean, now it's many millions. So, but it was all Indonesia, the whole country was a Dutch colony. But it fell to the Japanese. And so the women were put in camps, men were put in separate camps, and I think it was children, boys under age 11 or so were stayed with their moms. But once they became 11 or so, they were shipped off to the men's camp. separated from their mothers. So, you know, and then, you know, my mom, who was 17 at the time, was found out that she spoke Japanese. So the Japanese commanders put her in charge of all the women in the camp. And so she became the leader for all the women at age 17. And their diet in these prisoner of war camps, for the women especially, was horrible. They had one bowl of rice. They got a quarter of a slice of bread, which they used human urine for the yeast, and they got a cup of coffee, a spoon of sugar, and unlimited water for the entire day. They had one meal a day. So, needless to say, they were starving. And so, there was an instance where one of the women had stolen a pot of rice from the kitchen and to help feed her child. It actually was my mother's cousin, and she had a baby, you know, a toddler. And so it was discovered this pot of rice was stolen. So the commander ordered all the women and children to stand in the courtyard of the camp under the hot tropical sun until we get a confession. Now, my mother knew that if, you know, there was a confession, her cousin would be killed. So, you know, the women are standing around, children are starting to get fussy and all that. And my mother went to the commander and said, you know, maybe if I can speak to them in their own language, I can get a confession for you. This was her thought. So the commander said, okay, because she didn't want to speak any of the languages any of the soldiers might understand, which was Malay, which was, you know, Bahasa Malay, which is the language of Indonesia, which they all spoke. It's English, they all spoke. So she didn't want to do that, so she thought she would speak to the people in Arabic, because they were all Iraqi Jewish women. So she spoke to the women and wagged her finger at them and said in Arabic, "Don't confess, because they will kill the person who stole the rice." And she said, "I will get us out of this jam, so to speak, and I'll figure a way out. But whatever happens, do not confess." And then she went back to the commander and told the commander, "Well, I talked to them, and everyone says that, no, none of them stole the pot of rice. Can you tell me what the pot of rice looked like?" And he said, "Well, it had one handle on it." So she said, well, and, you know, she bowed, because the Japanese made everyone bow. And she said, while everyone waits here, can I go into the kitchen and look for it? And he said, okay, you go in the kitchen, look for it, and everyone will stand at attention here. So she went in the kitchen, and she rummaged through everything she could find and found a pot with two handles on it. With what little strength she had, she broke it off.
Wow.
And came out with a pot with one handle. Now, my mother said, I don't know for sure if he bought it, but it was a way of him saving face too, and he let everyone go.
Wow.
And so she had saved a life there. And you know, the women in the Jewish women, they did what best they could. They would like hide like a ring and sell a ring through the fence for any scraps of food they could get from any of the villagers. They did, for some reason, my mother said that the Dutch prisoners were dying like flies, but the Jewish women, who somehow managed to get garlic into their diet, seemed to survive. So, you know, it was interesting that she said garlic or chili or anything like that helped them survive. and
Interesting.
and then on you know, and occasionally they would you know, even smuggle in tomatoes and put it here,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
whatever they could just to survive. But they rarely got any food. Now, in the men's camp, my father told me several stories. Well, the men's camp had a different way of handling the men. Now, my father and my uncles and all that said, well, they were not starved. They were given enough food, actually, but they were forced to work from morning till night, okay? And they had to do field work, they had to build roads, they had to do runways, they had to do everything. They were basically slave labor, but being fed. So, and it was an interesting way of handling it, in that, like, for example, one time they were doing field work, and there was a Dutch guy, not Jewish, who was working in the field, who was younger than my father, and just thought it was funny to take lumps of clay and throw it at my dad. And my dad got upset with him and said, stop doing that. And he wouldn't stop, and they almost broke out into a fight in the middle of the field. And the Japanese said, no, 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 we'll settle this a different way. And they actually made a boxing ring and let the prisoners and the guards watch the two of them duke it out.
Wow.
And with boxing gloves, and my father had his younger brother in the corner who was like coaching him and telling him when to jab left, hit right, you know, kidney punch, whatever. And my dad apparently knocked out this younger man in the boxing match, and his father got upset with him and said, why did you do that to my son? And my dad said, look, I didn't want this. Your son was the one that started it. He kept throwing clay at me in the field while I was working.
Right.
And so, you know, that's what happened. Then the other system that was quite interesting was that in that camp where my father was, you showed up for work in the morning. At the end of the day, you were given currency, money for your work. And then you would use that money to buy food from the villagers. And that was how it worked. So what happened was, there was a Dutch guy in the camp, and he was the civilian camp leader of the men. And he said to the Jewish man, he said, you know, I don't feel like doing any of this work anymore. He says, you guys go out and do the work, and then I'm going to collect 10% of what you collect every day. And if you don't give me that, I'm going to create problems for you. So in the beginning, the Jewish men met, and they said, well, look, if he creates problems for us, he can have us killed. He can make up stuff, and the Japanese will just kill us. So in the beginning, they started to give him money. And my uncle, who was a barber by trade, was the camp barber, and he was one day giving a haircut and shave to the camp commander, the Japanese camp commander. And he was in middle of the shave when he said to the Japanese commander, you know, I hear you're collecting money from the prisoners for the emperor Tenohika, you know, which was the Japanese emperor, which was more than just like a president to them. The emperor was actually a god, a deity.
Okay.
And so the commander stood up out of his chair mid-shave and took out his sword, threatening my uncle. And my uncle said, whoa, 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 let me explain. And he explained it to him that this man said he was collecting money for the emperor, which is what he claimed he was doing, but they all knew he wasn't.
Right.
He was just pocketing the money. So, and not working. So then he wiped off the foam off of his face and took off the smock and told his lieutenants, get everyone out into the courtyard right now. So he ordered everyone at attention in the courtyard. Then he had his lieutenant have a clipboard and pen. And then he went through to all the men, and he said, each man, he went to like Judah, how much money was taken from you? And he would say, 12 rupiahs or whatever. And he would say, Aslan, how much was taken from you? Oh, 15 rupiahs. And how much was taken from you, Aaron, and whatever. And they went down the list. Then he had the lieutenant was writing all this down on the clipboard. And the commander said, all this money is going to be returned to you.
Wow.
So he returned it. Then he ordered everyone into the barracks and ordered this man who had stolen the money to be bound. His arms were bound, and he was, and feet were bound, and he was on the ground. And the prisoners were watching from the barracks, inside the barracks. Right. And basically, he took out his samurai sword and went right through him, and he was taken away.
Awful.
And so that was his punishment for that. But then I know going back towards the end of the war, it's interesting. You remember in my story I was telling you that my father was born in Burma, Rangoon? And there were not huge, but Jewish communities in Burma and Indonesia. Each of them had thousands of people. And my dad immigrated to Indonesia when he was around 17 years old from Burma.
Yeah.
And most of the Jewish people who went from Burma went to Indonesia for some reason, except my dad's first cousin and his uncle and all that. They had an American trade store in Burma, and he had connections with America. I didn't know this till later on in my life, but because I never knew why they went straight from Burma to the United States. It was because he had this U.S. trade business that was importing things from America, selling them in Burma. So they all went to San Francisco, and his family name was Batat, B-A-T-T-A-T. Now, my dad's first cousin, which was Morris Batat, went on to becoming a nuclear engineer, and he was an engineer at the Los Alamos facility under Oppenheimer developing the atomic bomb.
Wow. Now,
this will sound almost crazy, but I know my mother told me that all the women at the end of the war, towards the end of the war, what they'd later find out was the end of the war, they were ordered to dig a trench along the fence line of the camp. And they said, why? And the commander said, well, we're going to plant trees to buffet the wind. It wasn't for that reason, because they asked, how deep do you want us to dig? And they said, oh, about 2 meters, which is 6 feet. Okay? So they started to dig, and they realized that this was their end. They were digging their own grave. And under the eye of these guards. And after the first day, though, the commander said, there's been a change. We're not going to plant trees anymore. And just go back to the barracks. And later on, about 2 weeks later, they never got news in the camp to know, but about 2 weeks later, they found out that that's when the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and later on Nagasaki. Because about 2 weeks after that event where they were digging, the camps were freed. So then they got news once they were out and found this information out. And I was thinking to myself, my goodness, my dad's cousin who worked on the atomic bomb actually saved my mother's life. If you think about it. Now, the atomic bomb, I know was a horrible thing, and it killed many hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians and all that. But, they said that if the bomb hadn't dropped on Japan, many more lives would have been lost in a battle for Japan. We could have lost 1 million soldiers in the battle for Japan if it was a ground operation. And so, in a way, the atomic bomb did save many lives. Right. Yeah. And I wouldn't be here had it not been for that. Very interesting. So, that's related. And then my father and mother, they after World War II ended in Indonesia, there was a civil war that broke out in Indonesia, and for independence of the country. They wanted to get away from the Dutch colonialism.
Right.
So one war ended, another war started. My mother's family, to escape that war, went to Australia for a while. And then they eventually returned when things calmed down in Indonesia. And my father saw that the Indonesians were basically slaughtering Dutch citizens there. And so he took it upon himself, because he was from Burma. He had a British passport. And so he could travel freely through Indonesia. And he rode a bicycle and was looking for where the checkpoints were and helped Dutch families escape Indonesia by boats set up so that they could escape and not be killed. So he was doing that for a while. And eventually, when things calmed down in 1948, my parents were married at the synagogue in Surabaya, Indonesia. And they had a synagogue there for more than 100 years. But of lately, the Jewish population was in such decline there that I think the synagogue was what I understand, it's sort of sad, but the last Jewish person standing basically claimed rights to the synagogue and sold it. So, and he moved to Israel, but he got the money. I don't know what he did with it, but anyway, but there's a Jewish cemetery there in Surabaya where my paternal grandmother and grandfather are buried, and my maternal grandfather are buried. And I went to Indonesia in 1981, and I saw their grave sites were still there then. And I saw the synagogue then too. My father had a brother who still lived there then. You know, and my father came to this country New Year's Eve 1949, and they came by ship from Indonesia, and they went through immigration in Hawaii, I believe. And they landed in Los Angeles, and they had some family there, and they said, well, it's New Year's Eve, we're going to go and celebrate at the Hollywood Palladium. They were in Los Angeles, and they celebrated New Year's Eve. There was no jet lag because they came by ship, and they went with some family members there who greeted them. But my dad didn't have very much money when he came into Los Angeles. He had $50 US, which maybe is like $500 of today. I don't know, but he took the first job he could get, and he was moving boxes of television antennas in a factory from here to load them onto trucks. That was the first job he could get, and then eventually he decided he wanted to learn to drive because when he was in Indonesia, as before the war, and that he was doing well for himself. He had a chauffeur. He had never had to learn how to drive.
Right.
So he learned how to drive in California, and he decided he wanted to go back into sales, and he first went selling door-to-door men's undergarments. Then he said he pivoted and he decided to buy women's purses that had those little plastic beads. I don't know if you remember that from the 50s or so, but they were beaded bags, and he was going door to door selling those. And then after a while, he saw that in those days, California and the United States had a lot of factories, and they were making lots of things. So he decided to do that. And by the way, when he just started the selling on his own, he said he was making 10 times what he made in the factory. So just selling products door to door. But he decided he would go into the tools, and that's what he did for the brunt of his life. He was selling everything from power tools, hand tools, air tools, all kinds of things to factories. And eventually he developed a route, and he was going back to the same people because either their tools wore out, or the employees stole the tools, or they were expanding and needed more tools. And so he would sell tools out of the trunk of his car to all the factories, and there was so many of them, and he would go all over. In fact, I remember one of the factories he sold to made parts for the Viking lander that went to Mars, the first vehicle that landed on Mars from the United States. And the factory owner had a picture on the wall of him shaking hands with President Nixon. And so, I mean, he was selling to every factory, and we made so many products back then. I still have a tape measure from a factory that he sold to that says "Made in USA" on the tape measure. And you know, they made all kinds of things there. And my dad flourished with that. He did well. He managed to put all three of us through college. He put my brother through law school. We had nice family vacations. He used to joke he would work so that he would go on vacation. And he took our family to Europe, to Israel, to all kinds of places. And he always used to say to me, "You got to do your traveling before your medicine bag weighs more than your suitcase."
I've never heard that. That's interesting.
So yeah, and they used to like going to Las Vegas and all kinds of things. They would. My parents took nice trips. I had a nice, happy childhood growing up.
Good.
And but yeah.
Very interesting.
Did you have any questions for me?
No, I think you answered everything. That's very interesting. It's a whole different way than what we've always learned or heard of. So that's
it's different because, like I said, my family background is from Iraq. I have a book that was given to my father at home about the Batat family. It was given to him by his uncle, and it's a genealogy book. If you ever want to see it, I could show it to you, because it traces back that Batat family for more than 500 years.
Yeah.
And it even had someone who was a political, he was fighting against the Sultan, and he was hanged by the Sultan, one member of the family.
Wow.
And yeah, there was a lot. And then I had another book that was about the Jews of Burma. And in it I read something about my father that I didn't know, and he died in 1984, and I got this book after he died, but his name was mentioned, and people mentioned him in the book and said that he was the one. He was out selling, obviously, in Mandalay, Burma, and he had went to a stream to get some water, and he noticed that the water tasted funny. He said the water tasted like kerosene, and he alerted the British, and the British saw it, and then they did some testing, and they found out that there was oil there. And so he was the one who discovered oil in Burma.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Accidentally.
Wow.
And he alerted the British that, and then he never got a cent for it, but he was the one who discovered it.
It's great.
But yeah, and so I have a book also at home about the Jews of Burma.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
And sharing your story with us, and good luck.
I hope I wasn't too boring.
Oh, very interesting. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.